Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see such a robust crowd. Um, I want to welcome you all to the Atlantic Council. I'm Tom Cunningham, the Deputy Director of the Global Energy Center. I'm very pleased to welcome you all here today for a conversation about efforts to encourage the disclosure of climate-related financial risk information. I almost said to discourage. That's not the point here. The emerging topic is gaining significance and attention, particularly as the Paris Climate Agreement will shortly enter into force. The governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, characterized climate change as the tragedy of the horizon because its impacts will be felt beyond the horizon that most actors consider, beyond traditional business cycles, political cycles, and the purview or remit of other institutions like central banks. Our conversation today is about determining the best ways to define and disclose what Carney identified as those risks of climate change to potential investors, lenders, and other stakeholders. The goal of such disclosure is not just to help build the costs of climate change and associated policies into the economy, but also to harness markets to deal with this climate challenge. The corollary benefit, I think, is to increase transparency across industries, which are all going to need to deal with this challenge, and should do so in ways that are uniform and compatible. Today we'll discuss two ongoing complementary efforts to promote the disclosure of climate-related financial risk information, one led by the G20 Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and the other led by the U.S. government. The task force seeks to develop recommendations for voluntary climate-related financial disclosures in order to measure and respond to these risks and encourage firms to align their disclosures with investors' needs. The U.S. government's approach utilizes procurement regulations to encourage climate disclosure. Of course, not everyone may agree with the need for this type of disclosure, but I would say that this fact adds to the value of today's discussion to flesh out this issue further, because I don't think that issue will be going away anytime soon, or the need. So we have a great panel to discuss this and both approaches with the common goal of greater transparency and stability in financial markets. We're very excited to have with us today Mary Shapiro, who was chair of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission from 2009 to 2012 and is currently serving as secretariat of the G20 Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And Mary was the first woman to serve as SEC chairman. And apparently you testified before Congress 45 times in that position, and the only person to have served as both chairman of the SEC and of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. Upon her departure, Obama praised her leadership, saying the SEC became stronger and the financial system safer and better able to serve the American people. We are very fortunate to have her here today at the Atlantic Council. Also with us is Ali Zaidi, Associate Director for Natural Resources, Energy, and Science at the White House Office of Management and Budget. In this role, Zaidi leads a team of policy and budget experts overseeing a wide variety of policy, budget, and management, believe it or not, issues across nearly a $100 billion portfolio and a number of federal agencies. He brings to the position a strong background in the design and implementation of federal policies and the development of public and private sector partnerships to increase U.S. energy security and cut harmful carbon pollution. Since February 2009, Zaidi has served in a number of roles within the Obama administration, and we're lucky he's chosen to share his experience and expertise with us today. And finally, last but not least, moderating our discussion is David Goldwyn, chairman of the Global Energy Center's advisory group and also a non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. He is also president of Goldwyn Global Strategies, an international energy advisory consultancy. Former U.S. government positions include Special Envoy and Coordinator for International Energy Affairs at the Department of State and Assistant Secretary for International Affairs at the Department of Energy. I want to note that David has played a tremendous role in the launch and strategic direction of our Global Energy Center. He's also co-chair of a new project here, the Global Energy Governance Task Force, which is working now to assess and propose new strategies for existing global multilateral energy governance structures. I want to thank you, David, for associating your expertise with the Atlantic Council and for making today's event possible. So once again, thank you to our guests and to all of you for being here. I look forward to a good conversation. I want to remind everyone that today's discussion is on the record and is streaming live. Please join in the conversation on Twitter, which is blowing up right now at AC Global Energy, and don't forget to use the hashtag AC Energy. All right, everybody, please come forward. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Tom, for those terrific introductions, and welcome, everybody. This is a really important topic which seems to have had more prominence in Europe, where Mark Carney resides as head of the Bank of England, than it's had here. But it's a very important topic, and that's why we thought we would talk about it. We would talk about it today. And it started with Mark Carney's speech, which is outside on the tragedy, the horizons. It turned into a Financial Stability Board G20 task force, chaired by Mike Bloomberg, and where Mary Shapiro is the senior advisor. They've gone through a process of explaining, why this matters, and taking comments from industry. And by December, they will put out suggested language for a cross-section of industries, and then take additional comments. But the U.S. government has also been concerned about this, and I think the place to start this morning, is first to start with our most experienced financial securities regulator, but to explain, why did this get started? What are the risks? And if investors don't know enough about climate risk disclosure, what sort of information are we likely to see requested, and what kind of language is going to be helpful?
Sure. So thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's really wonderful for me to be able to talk about the task force and in a room full of people who know so much about these issues. So as was mentioned, Mark Carney gave a speech about a year ago called The Tragedy of the Horizon. And the tragedy is really that by the time climate change is something we're all factoring into our everyday decision making, it may be too late. And that therefore it was important for the financial system, it was actually a matter of financial stability for us to have better disclosure around climate-related financial impacts. So the G20 asked Mark to create a task force that would look at these issues in more detail and come back with a set of recommendations. And the task force was created early this year. 31 representatives from around the world, all industry participants. And the remit from the Financial Stability Board was to build on the great work that's already been done by regulators, by NGOs, by industry in trying to develop disclosure frameworks and make sense of all of those different frameworks and come forward with a comprehensive set of recommendations that would enable the disclosure of financial impacts from climate-related events. And what's different about what we've done than many of those other frameworks is, first of all, we've focused very much on transition risk. Physical risk, we all understand. It's rising sea levels, it's a warming planet, it's access to resources like water being compromised. But there's also the transition risk, which has the potential to have very profound financial impacts on companies. And so we focused on financial impacts, and building on the work of others have created a framework that will enable companies to do a better job of disclosing material financial impacts from climate-related events. We really broadly viewed our remit as really solving three problems with one solution. The first problem is companies actually, in most of the G20, maybe all of the G20 jurisdictions, certainly in the United States, already have an obligation to disclose material risk. Climate's not accepted from that in any way, and in fact, in 2010, the SEC directed companies to think specifically about climate impacts and whether they were material, and if so, to disclose them. So companies have this necessity to make disclosure, but they haven't really had a good framework through which to make that kind of disclosure. Investors are demanding this information. Every survey shows that a high percentage of institutional investors want better disclosure around climate-related risk. But they don't get that disclosure. They get boilerplate, they get non-comparable numbers, so you can't compare companies across an industry or within a sector. And the third problem is regulators want this information because they need to be able to see if risks are building in the financial system. And so our view was we should be able to create a framework for disclosure that satisfies all the problems of these three main constituencies, and which in addition enables underwriters and lenders and investors, the main foundations of the financial system, to make better informed decisions about lending, about investing, and about underwriting.
That's good. Let's unpack a couple of the concepts. So first, transition risk. What's really meant by transition risk? Is this the sudden invention of battery storage and technology, or is this sudden transition in the weather or something else?
No, it's more the former than the latter. I would say the sudden transition of weather is more of a physical risk. But if you think about big technology advances, or you think about the fact that nearly 200 countries signed on to COP21 and a commitment to reduce or to limit global warming, you could have policy or regulatory or legislative decrees in countries that would cause an abrupt repricing potentially of fossil fuel assets, as an example of a transition risk. So that kind of sudden transition in the economy as a result of legislative fiat or technological change could send real shudders through the financial system, depending on the exposure of investors or lenders or underwriters to those assets that have been abruptly repriced as a result of a policy change. So we focus very much on that because given the fact that the world has largely signed on to trying to limit greenhouse gas emissions, those transition risks are very real.
Okay. And you were chair when the first climate-related disclosure requirements came out. So can you paint a little bit of a picture of what kind of disclosures are going to be helpful? Is it scenario planning for different price levels, or either in energy or in housing or in any others? What might this look like?
So it can look like different things in different companies. So some companies are much more exposed to climate risk than others are. If you look at the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board's work, climate change and climate change related risks are ubiquitous. They affect more than 90% of the value of the capital markets. Something like 73 out of 79 industries are exposed to climate risk, but it manifests quite differently in different industries, and you can imagine that. In agriculture, it will manifest differently than it will in the utility business, than it will in the pharmaceutical business. So one of the, I think, important things about the framework that we've developed is that it has flexibility. So there's a set of recommendations that really any company anywhere in the world ought to be able to adopt, and it goes to the governance of risk within the company. And we talk about how does the board oversee climate-related risk? How does the company think about it? How do you measure it? How do you manage it? How do you incorporate it into your existing risk management functions? How do you hold people accountable for consideration of climate-related risk? Do you use scenario analysis? If it's a company that's relatively new to these issues, that might be a qualitative discussion about scenario planning. But if you're a very sophisticated, large public company, you might well be deeply engaged already in scenario analysis and in quite a quantitative way. And so there's a certain amount of flexibility in how we've tried to approach this, because these are voluntary standards. And at the end of the day, our goal is absolutely to get the maximum adoption and implementation that we can. But at the same time, we need to get all companies and asset owners, asset managers, banks, and other financial institutions on a path of providing this disclosure, because investors need it to make informed capital allocation decisions.
Okay, terrific. Well, we'll come to some of the questions in a second, but Ali, you're now at the Office of Management and Budget. You've been at DPC and advised Secretary Chu and others, but why does the Office of Management and Budget care about climate risk? What's the risk to the U.S. government, and what's the management issue, and what's the budget issue that's involved in all this?
That's a great question. The way we approach it, and what I think inspires us to be leaders in this space, is we've got sort of three responsibilities that fall precisely in this sphere. First, on the sort of procurement and supply chain side, OMB really has a responsibility to get out and articulate best practices, approaches to managing the supply chain to advance the missions of the various agencies. and really protect the taxpayer as part of that. And so one of our core responsibilities and one of the things that brings us to this work is ensuring that there is consistent and clear policy from a procurement perspective across the federal government. The second thing that brings us to this work is, we've been part of the core team over the last several years that's advanced this corpus of work of integrating the best economics and science into the decision making of the federal government. That's manifested itself in things like the social cost of carbon, which has shown up in a bunch of the rulemaking that we've done. It's guided our work in bringing an appreciation for the need to curb carbon pollution from a host of sources, like from airplanes to the power sector to mobile sources on the ground. And so that sort of well of economic and technical scientific knowledge really comes to bear in a context like this, and that's another reason why we're engaged. And then finally, whether you're looking back or you're looking forward, climate risk is manifesting itself from a real budget, in real budget terms. So if you look back over the last decade, the direct and indirect costs from extreme weather and things like wildfire suppression have cost the federal government over $360 billion. And as we look forward, we know that this is something that's going to show up in things like health costs, with air-related diseases increasing. That shows up at places like CMMS. And it's going to show up as things like wildfire costs continue to hike. And it's going to show up in the form of disaster relief. And we're really spending a lot of time internally as the OMB, and I know our colleagues on the Hill, places like CBO, GAO, are spending a lot of time really stress testing, has the federal government been solicitous enough of the reality that we face today, and are we taking the appropriate steps to really measure that and then mitigate it? So those are the, I think, 3 entry points for us.
Terrific. Now, you've already done some work on this. You all issued some procurement regulations a few months ago. So can you talk a little bit about what have you asked companies that are providing goods and services to the U.S. government to do, and have you seen them respond yet?
So look, just to set the order of magnitude here, the federal government purchases $440 billion of goods and services every year. That's a big number. And when you're writing the checks for $440 billion of goods and services on behalf of the taxpayer, that should keep you up at night if you aren't spending time measuring the risk. And so one of the things we've gone out and asked companies to do is tell us how they're thinking about things like their greenhouse gas intensity, but then also help us think about how to best manage the supply chain vulnerabilities that they face. So an example of that is in 2014, we actually ran a procurement that integrated the social cost of carbon into a mobility services contract. So, the FedEx, UPS line of business. And we really tested it to see if folks were integrating this thinking into the way they did business. Going forward, I think we're really thinking more and more about how climate factors into things like the location for real property decisions, all the way to procurement of goods that could be impacted from a supply chain basis as a result of extreme weather.
Terrific. Well, let me talk about some of the questions we've been getting. The first one on transition risk. So in the energy world, they've had a big, I wouldn't call it a transition, but I think values have dropped in half. It's been the prices have been very, very volatile, and so we've had a huge drop in asset values, but without a significant shock to the financial system overall. So how does that play into planning for transition risk? Is there more disclosure that should happen, or if it hasn't happened now, what could happen that could be worse?
Great. I mean, I'd love to get Mary's views in on this as well, but from a federal perspective, there are a set of things the federal government just does, and those are stepping in to advance the public good where the markets aren't going to do that. On the upside, the example is there's underinvestment in clean energy R&D. Private sector just doesn't put up the sort of money that we would expect as a percentage of the GDP. And so we're stepping in to fill that gap and advance the public good because we know that's net beneficial from a economy-wide perspective. On the flip side of that, to Mary's point earlier, we've got to be concerned as a federal government. We're very concerned about things like inefficient appreciation of risk or inefficient allocation of capital. And so when people are not spending enough to, for example, shore up their assets relative to the climate risk that they might be exposed to from a physical perspective, we could ignore that, but the reality is that's something that from a federal disaster relief perspective is going to come due to us. And so from our perspective, getting information out there of those forward-looking risks is really important. And if folks are underinvesting in that from a resource perspective, that's something we want to encourage. So, there's this, I think, broader point of transition risk for, in particular, the oil, gas, and coal sector. But I think taking a step back and looking at it more generically, there's a question of, taking out an insurance policy and doing smart analysis and helping that advance efficient allocation of capital. That's what we're trying to advance through our various actions.
That's great. You can comment on that,
yeah,
please.
I would just add to that. I think that's exactly right. That 80% of institutional investors have said that they need to make ESG broadly, but climate in particular,
ESG, sorry.
environmental, social, and governance considerations in their investing decisions. And climate change is the most, frankly, the most heightened, I think they would say, and important of all of those. And the inability to have information that's company specific, that's comparable from company to company, does not allow them to make the most informed investment decisions that they can make. And if you're an asset owner, if you're a pension fund and you have long-term liabilities, what companies think about their prospects over the longer term, not just the quarter, not just the year, maybe not just the next 3 years, but the next 5 or 10 years, is really important to your capital allocation decisions. So the demand for this information is not diminishing. Whether it's a financial stability issue or not, and I think many central bankers think that it is, many finance ministers think that it is. Nonetheless, investors are demanding this information so that they can do the best job possible for the beneficiaries on whose behalf they're working. And without the disclosure as a mitigant and an illumination to their decision making, a mitigant to the risk and an illuminator of the decision making, their best guess is all we get as their ultimate beneficiaries. And so the disclosure really needs to be there, and it needs to be comprehensive, and it needs to come out in the public documents and the public way, not the way generally institutional investors get it now, which is by sending a survey to the company and answer these 400 questions, public company, about how you think about climate and how it's incorporated into your business strategy and business planning. Well, that's great for that institutional investor, but the rest of us don't get to share in that information. There's a profound unfairness to that as well. So I think this is not a niche issue anymore. This is mainstream. Investors, lenders, underwriters need this information.
And let me jump in on that, actually, because there are 140 million Americans who are beneficiaries of pension plans that are governed by rules put forward by the Department of Labor. And so that's another thing that I think we've taken a keen interest in, is making sure that group of folks and the managers there are getting the information they need, again, to Mary's point, so that, even if it's if it's a beyond 2-year time horizon issue, and maybe it's not a risk to the markets generally, these are people who've worked their entire lives, put money up into a pension fund. They're counting on that coming back, whether or not the markets as a whole are doing great or not. And so one of the things we've done is really ask for folks to be thinking about disclosure in that context as well, and something that the Labor Department's been advancing in that context. And that's something we're doing at the federal level, but we know that's a big consideration for state pension managers. Just last week, the managers of the $45 billion pension fund in Maryland came out and said, this is something they're concerned about. They're going to start testing their portfolio for climate risk and greenhouse gas issues. So this is something that's, I think, picking up steam, because, if you're responsible for ensuring that these people's hard-earned money isn't part of a lottery game, then you're going to be asking for more information.
This is how Mark Carney got the attention in his speech. He was speaking to the UK insurance industry and said, essentially, you've got our pension funds, in your hands. Are you doing your job? Mm-hmm. Are you accurately addressing risk? Let me ask you about uncertainty, because for companies that are looking ahead, whether you're a wind company or an oil company or a power generation company, you're looking out wondering what the price of your commodity is going to be, or what the demand is going to be in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. And so there's a lot of uncertainty about Paris implementation. There's uncertainty even in the US regulatory system, and there's always uncertainty about long-term prices. So if these if the voluntary language which is proposed is implemented, what does the company do about that extreme level of uncertainty about what the future holds?
So that's been a feature of the securities markets and corporate disclosure forever. That you have, in the context of forward-looking information, you make some assumptions, and you talk about what could happen. The way we've tried to deal with that in a concrete way in the task force is through the use of scenario analysis, and we looked across a lot of different scenarios, an NDC scenario, a 2-degree scenario, a number of others, and we will encourage the use of a 2-degree scenario as a baseline, and then encourage companies to utilize other scenarios that might make sense for their scenario planning, their business planning, but also for disclosure purposes, so that, again, we'll have information that we can compare from one company to another. But the nature of scenario analysis is to understand what's possible, what's even unlikely but possible, in order to understand the magnitude of impact from those scenarios eventuating. But the federal securities laws in the U.S. already require disclosure of material information, of known trends and uncertainties. Climate change is a big uncertainty. Nonetheless, we know it has the potential to have enormous transitional or physical impact on most businesses, and therefore ought to be discussed and disclosed. It can be done qualitatively. It doesn't have to be done with numbers, but it needs to be disclosed.
That's great. Now, the U.S. government has a social cost of carbon. Some companies today are using a shadow price of carbon for deciding things like project allocation. So they might pick a number, at least. Now, they do these not by committing in their securities documents, but they do it. They describe them on their ESG reports, and they say, we're going to use a $60 or $70 price of carbon, and we don't allocate a project unless it can survive that, as I guess is a shadow projection of carbon implementation. Is that a helpful practice? Is that the kind of practice you think all industry should be required, or that companies should, in a sense, if they're going to say that, they should be obliged to fulfill?
So we don't direct in our recommendations that people use a carbon price, but we ask for disclosure around that if they do, and how they concluded to use that.
Terrific.
Look, I think the latest tally is 5,800 companies, 60% of global market cap are doing some version of this. And it's not our job to tell those folks how to run their businesses or what good business is. I think they can figure it out. But I think there's a little bit of a maybe a lagging appreciation for how much has happened to transform the climate landscape over the last couple of years. And it's while uncertainty remains, it's hard to say that sitting in a boardroom this is not a material consideration. And I would imagine that sitting in most of these boardrooms, there's a sense that the trend line is pretty clear. So, you know, I think folks who are planning in this way are going to come out ahead because they're going to be on the right side of the way this issue breaks as Paris sets up a ratcheting up mechanism, as things like just in the last month, the aviation industry starts to move into a market-based approach to dealing with its emissions. That was a big breakthrough. Things like the phase-out of hydrofluorocarbons, a huge amendment that we secured in Kigali. That's impacting a big segment of industry. These are things that are happening, and even if you set aside all of the regulatory stuff, and even if you set aside all of the international work that's taken place, which, by the way, I don't think most people would have bet all of these things would have come together this year the way they have. I'd always hearkened back to the last time we had a battle on whether the production tax credit and the investment tax credit for solar and wind should be extended. And we've gotten to a point on clean energy where the costs are coming down so quickly, the uptake is happening so rapidly, and the jobs are so clear and palpable for communities all around the United States that it's hard for, I think, the political economy to swing the other direction. It's not, people aren't just betting on the upside. The upside's here, and it's now risk aversion. So we've kicked into a different gear, and I think people who are baking that into their corporate decision making are going to come out ahead.
Great. Let me ask you both, maybe starting with you, Mary, about outcomes, because in a sense, you want disclosure and you want companies to describe, give shareholders an informed decision, but you're also hoping for outcomes. So maybe talk about a couple of industries, maybe housing, maybe energy, maybe other areas where resilience is important. If this is implemented, sort of 3 years, 5 years from now, what kind of behavioral change are you hoping will come out of this?
Well, Allie should speak to this too. I think from my perspective, the disclosure is all about understanding what the impact is on companies of climate change. We're actually not about the reverse, which is the way most people have thought about these issues for many years. We're not about the impact companies are having on the environment. And that's an important distinction, particularly since our remit comes from central bankers and finance ministers, to think about this in terms of what's the impact on companies. And so what you would expect to see with disclosure that allows investors or underwriters or lenders to look across companies within a sector is that capital will be allocated to the companies that are most effectively dealing with these issues, that have disclosed most clearly what the impacts are, have disclosed and undertaken mitigating actions to diminish the impact of climate change on their operations. And what that translates down into on the granular level, we'll have to see. But it will give investors the tools they need to make informed decisions about where to be investing and for how long. And that will be an enormous discipline in the marketplace.
Look, we obviously support the disclosure approach, and the president was among the leaders who joined the G20 in saying we're excited about the work that Mary and her team come out with at the end of the year. But in many ways, that's the baseline. And part of it's going to be companies stepping up and going beyond the baseline. Part of it's going to be government saying, hey, after looking at the data, after looking across the portfolio, there's some things that are just common sense. We got to be hard-nosed. We got to be regulatory about it. And a couple places where that's going to show up and where we're already moving out. One is in the flood risk space. So flood risk there's uncertainty associated with it, but it's not idiosyncratic. We know, we have modeling, we know how to mitigate it, we know how high we need to build in certain places. And so you're seeing the Department of Housing and Urban Development put out standards for how high you need to build in certain places. FEMA has gone out with standards on flood risk saying when we rebuild, we're going to rebuild in a certain way. Even through this set of funds that's often deployed in the wake of an emergency, the Community Development Block Grant, we've pushed a thing called the Fortified Building Code standard as something communities need to be considering to deal with wind risk. So you're going to see, I think, the federal government really start to set baseline standards on top of this disclosure regime. And to Mary's point about the directionality of disclosure, one of the things I think we're able to do is, because we're both an observer and an actor in this space, as an actor, we're going to hold ourselves to that higher standard and say, through our NEPA analysis, which applies to significant federal actions, the National Environmental Policy Act analysis, we're going to be looking at not just the impact of climate on the investments we're putting in the ground, but our impact on what we're doing to the local adaptability and preparedness for climate risk. I think what that will do is, one, you'll see a quick uptake of baseline standards, whether it's in the building codes arena, in where and how you build. I think the second thing you'll see is a greater valuation on preparedness and resilience measures. So there's a new study that the Nature Conservancy just did that showed there are billions of dollars of benefits that wetlands produced to prevent damage when Hurricane Sandy came through. Mm-hmm. You're going to see investment in things like that because we'll be able to monetize it, because we will have a fuller understanding of the economics here. So I think that's how you'll start to see this data really serve as the sort of holding up a mirror to folks, and people finally see what's going on. They're going to take more rational actions.
So in the theory, there'll be shareholders will value investments in resilience?
Sure. I mean, it's a little bit as simple as, and Mike Bloomberg says this all the time, what you measure is what you manage. And if you have transparency into measuring what these impacts are from a financial perspective on the companies that you own as a shareholder, or you lend to as a bank, or you underwrite as an insurance company, those companies will do a better job of managing those risks, and you'll do a better job of holding their feet to the fire in managing those risks.
Great. Well, we're going to open things up to questions from the audience. We have a very diverse set of actors here. I will have folks have microphones, so just raise your hand if you've got a question. And I'd just like to take the opportunity to say we've got some suggested reading for you outside. One is Mark Carney's speech on the tragedy of the horizons. The other is the op-ed that Brian Deese and Jeff Zients did this summer, I think, in the Wall Street Journal, which gives, I think, a very good exposition of sort of why the U.S. government cares and what sort of actions they're taking. And one of our advisory board members, Dan Yergin, and their team put out a study I shared with our panelists last week on whether transition risk is systemic risk. So we have that IHS Markit piece out as well. So now we can turn it over to questions for the audience. And while we're waiting for folks to come there, let me go ahead. Let's start with this lady here. If you could just identify yourself and then ask your question.
Thanks. Sure. My name is Amy Dine, and I'm with Terra Alpha Investments, and we're an investment fund where we actually use disclosed environmental data as a key piece of how we choose which companies we're investing in. We take the quote that Mary just said very seriously, that we look at companies that actually are measuring this, are the ones who are going to manage it, and find ways to be the most profitable companies in the future. So my question is, what can people in this room do to encourage the SEC to demand that these be part of disclosed quarterly filings, 10Ks, et cetera, because a traditional investor needs to see it there to be able to use it, unlike those of us in the room who actually know that it's already important to use.
That's great. Good question, the SEC. And you, when we spoke, you talked a little bit about the SEC has pretty broad powers. There's regulations, but there's also, interpretation things. If you can talk maybe both about what might happen and what your practices were.
Sure. So there's some, maybe even some would say lots of disclosure out there already about climate-related impacts. It has two big failings in my view. One is it's largely boilerplate, and the second is that it's hard to find. It's not in financial filings that are required by the SEC, but rather might be in an ESG report or on a company's website. And that's better than nothing for sure, but it's not where we need to be. So the remit of the task force, again, is voluntary standards. And so we're working very hard to balance cost effectiveness and doability for companies, asset owners, asset managers, banks, and others, with ambition to get actually really good disclosure out there that's decision useful for the financial markets. So the SEC has a couple of alternatives here. When we put out the climate release in 2010 that encouraged companies to think about these issues and evaluate their materiality and disclose them, we also commented a lot on company filings. Public companies' filings go into the SEC, and the SEC staff will actually write them a long comment letter that says, explain this number better, don't use this non-GAAP measure, why haven't you evaluated this more carefully and given better disclosure around it, that kind of thing. So the SEC could step up again, as we did in 2010, and do more aggressive commenting on company disclosure around climate-related financial impacts. They could also take the 2010 interpretive release and just renew it and talk about some of the developments since 2010. There have been many. Transition risk is something that's much more front of mind now than it was then. They could talk about some of those issues in an interpretation that would give companies guidance about the quality of their disclosure. They could continue to do something they have been doing, which is require companies, when they get a shareholder proposal that asks them to do a report or provide disclosure on a climate-related impact, the SEC has not been letting companies fail to include those in the proxy, and so shareholders actually get a chance to vote on that. So continuing that mainstream view of these proposals as appropriate under shareholder proposal rules is a good thing for the SEC to continue to do. They can write rules. They can write disclosure rules. They can write line item rules that say you must disclose X, Y, and Z, or they could write rules that give more clarity to the materiality of these kinds of disclosures. I don't know that they'll do that. They don't have to do that. They don't need to do that. Just by using their bully pulpit and talking about these issues more and more, companies will absolutely pay attention. They will look at the frameworks that exist, whether it's one of the existing ones or the new one that the task force will be proposing, and they can jump on board and utilize those to fulfill their disclosure obligations. So I never underestimate the value of the bully pulpit in an area like this, where companies are finely attuned to the nuances of what the SEC is saying and willing to satisfy those requirements before they actually become specific regulatory obligations.
In the course of the task force, did you come into contact with regulators from other jurisdictions? Are you seeing any of them either being ahead of the curve or starting to take this action?
Well, I mean, Europe is ahead of us in many ways with an EU directive in this area. Different countries are at different places. The SEC, I will say, very much to their credit, put out a concept release 6 months or so ago, on the whole disclosure regime. And a set of questions they asked were around the usefulness of sustainability disclosure and climate-related disclosure. And they got 267 unique comment letters. They got thousands of form letters. 80% of those encouraged the SEC to require more disclosure around ESG issues, and 2/3 of those focus very much on climate-related impacts. That's a pretty strong mandate for the SEC to receive from the public commenting on its proposal. So they have a foundation now to go forward on one of these many paths if they choose to do that. But the rest of the world is moving ahead, but I think there's tremendous interest in what the task force has been doing as the vehicle, as I said earlier, to satisfy the needs that issuers already have, that investors have, and regulators have as well.
Terrific. Start here. We'll take a couple.
Thank you very much. Kevin Massey with Statoil. My question goes back to the comment around scenario planning and the kind of qualitative element of risk measurement in an era or a future landscape with a lot of uncertainty in it. We already have a 2-degree scenario in our energy perspectives outlook, but you can get to the 2-degree outcome through many ways, through many assumptions. And my question is, will the task force recommendations be putting some guidelines or parameters around the way in which companies make assumptions around the 2-degree target? I mean, if you're a coal company, you can assume that the 2-degree scenario is reached by backing out non-coal resources. If you're an oil company, you can do a similar thing.
Sure, so great question. And I don't want to get too detailed on the task force's recommendations because, frankly, the Financial Stability Board is entitled to hear them first. But we obviously we've been testing a lot of our theories. We've had over 100 bilateral meetings with companies and institutional investors and others to talk about were our recommendations feasible and decision useful. And we do talk about the disclosure of assumptions, because if you don't understand what underlying assumptions have been made, the scenario analysis isn't really very useful.
That's great. Sure.
Thank you. Sherry Goodman, Atlantic Council Board Director. There's been much discussion about a major infrastructure initiative for the United States. How do you think what you're working on, Mary, is going to factor into resetting the nation's infrastructure, not only energy, but other ailing infrastructure we face? And Ali, how do you think, what's the sort of the next mountain to climb? I know the flood risk and the HFC amendment, obviously Paris, so much has been done. What's the next big area here that addresses sort of how we mainstream the climate risk and decision making into more of our processes?
So I think, look, we're at base all about disclosure. And with disclosure, the markets will direct, investors and lenders and others will direct where capital is allocated. And so whether it's an infrastructure bill or really any other kind of major initiative, the disclosure will help people understand the appropriate investment vehicle. We are about both the risks of climate-related issues and also the opportunities. And it's important to companies, and frankly, it's important to us as representatives effectively of investors in this process, that companies have the opportunity to talk about the opportunities that they see from climate change. And many companies see enormous opportunities in renewable energy, in recycling, in virtually every industry, there are opportunities that arise as well. And so I think when you're talking about an infrastructure bill and the opportunity for enormous sums of money to be spent with companies that have latched onto those opportunities and made them very real, there's probably a direct relationship between our disclosure and what can happen there. Ali probably has a much better answer than I do.
No, but I do want to riff on the infrastructure theme before getting to the second question. On infrastructure, when you look at deep decarbonization scenarios for the United States and for the world, there are a few things where you've got a bunch more sort of replacement cycles between now and the mid-century. Vehicles you'll probably replace 2 or 3 times. Appliances you'll replace a few times. But the long life infrastructure, you got sort of one shot, maybe a shot and a half. And so being very thoughtful about the greenhouse gas impacts, some of which are non-obvious, right? So the placement of transportation infrastructure and what it does to the sort of smart growth trajectory of a metropolitan region is pretty significant. The balance between transit and other modes of transportation is pretty significant. One of the ways we've been thinking about infrastructure, which we actually put out in our 21st century transportation plan at the beginning of the year, is how do we take advantage of things like automation, not just vehicles that drive themselves, but the lower levels of automation, sort of level 2, 3, where you're going to be using sensors to get things to be running more efficiently. So there are a bunch of things, I think, in the infrastructure space that are going to be very significant, and we need to be screening a lot of those through common sense flood work, and frankly, the implementation of the executive order, which FEMA and HUD have started, but DOT, SBA, and others are working on, is going to be, I think, a critical predicate to making sure whatever infrastructure spending happens going forward, it's done in a smart way from a resilience perspective. But there's this greenhouse gas question, which I think will be significant. I think the NEPA guidance is significant in that regard. But there's a lot more, I think, that needs to be brought to bear from a measurement and modeling perspective.
Flood risk seems to be one dimension, but there's heat risk, right? There's advanced modeling on extreme weather impacts.
Yeah, frankly, if you look at things like where we're going to be growing certain things, where the flows of commerce are going to be from a climate perspective, where are you incentivizing future ag growth? That's going to be dependent on where you're dredging and where you're building roads and where you're building trains. And so there's a lot that you can do unintentionally. And I think we're at this moment where, just like we were really deliberate around the time Eisenhower built out highways, we've got to be really deliberate and take into account all of the transitions that are happening domestically. I think from what is sort of the next big book of business look like, transportation is going to be a big piece of that. The fuel economy standards that were sort of the midterm of our light duty vehicle standards, that's a really big thing to get done for the next administration. And just sort of crosswalking it back to the climate risk discussion, you're sitting in Detroit in 2007, 2008. They went through a pretty big retooling. And now you've got minivans that are hybrid, and you got electric vehicles, and sort of breakthrough year this year on patents for EVs and storage technology. So there's been a big shift. So this is not something that, we're betting against industry on. I think there's a pretty great proof point that industry is able to take into account where things are going from a climate perspective and really invest in that direction. I think the second big piece is going to be in the land sector space. And this goes to some of the complexity which we shouldn't airbrush over. I've, I think, said a couple of times this is not idiosyncratic. There's uncertainty, but we can model our way to the right answer. We've got to do a lot of heavy lifting on building out the market mechanisms to incentivize forestation. We've got to incentivize the development of sinks. And here's where the things sort of start to fit together. In Prairie Pothole in North Dakota, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, along with some NGOs, set up a pilot project that helps build out conservation. and in turn helps build out sinks for greenhouse gases. That is being funded by offsets that Chevy is buying. So Chevy is paying for conservation in Prairie Pothole, North Dakota. And it's in part because they're starting to think about what does CO2 mean for them, what does greenhouse gas intensity mean for them, what does climate risk mean for them. So there's a connectivity between all of these things. And that connectivity is something we have to be really deliberate about, especially in a world where, frankly, we're working with sort of second best climate tools. In a world where we had first best climate tools, sort of economy-wide pricing, then maybe we wouldn't have to spend as much time thinking about this because it would flow down. But in a world where we're using second best tools, all of which have been incredibly effective in advancing the climate dialogue and moving us rapidly towards our goals, we've got to be really spending a lot of time getting the data out there so people are filling in the gaps and being as efficient as they can.
Super. A couple more in the back there, and then right here.
Hi, Callie Webb. I'm an independent analyst on climate and energy. Thank you to the Atlantic Council and the panelists for giving such a comprehensive overview. My question comes to the concept of transition and letting disclosure do the job. There is another thought process out there that says it's not transition, it's transformation. And in order to get transformation, given the possibility with a 2-degree scenario, that you have to do more faster because you have a carbon bubble and you have the concept of unburnable carbon. How is this program going to address that potential scenario?
Well, I think we will recommend the use of scenario analysis and with at least a single baseline scenario so that we can have comparability between companies in a sector and across sectors. But there are lots of scenarios possible, and we don't want to discourage companies from using others that might help enlighten our target audience, which again is investors, lenders, and underwriters, and investors. So, scenario analysis is not the be-all and the end-all for sure. There are, as we talked about, different assumptions that can be made that will greatly change what your output is. But getting people started on this path of thinking about these issues in those terms, we think is really an important first step.
And look, I think one piece of this that's important is we're not passive actors in which scenario is going to pan out. And one of the things that I think is really important to get out there, our Council on Economic Advisors put out a report a couple of years ago that talks about how much cost you incur by just delaying climate action. Now, we talk about it in the tens of billions and hundreds of billions of dollars. But that tens of billions and hundreds of billions of dollars crosswalks to different segments of the economy, different regions of the country, and it has very clear consequences for people and companies. And so whether we're taking a step-wise change in the future or whether we're having an ability to be smoother in terms of going from point A to point B, it kind of depends on how aggressive people are willing to be in getting to business. And so, it's easy to take a step back and say, oh, that's a $100 billion delay, and maybe we're okay with that. But that $100 billion delay is not going to fall on everybody equally. And it's important to be really thoughtful of what those different scenarios mean and for whom.
Great. Right here, and then we'll do the back row.
Hi, my name is Nancy Meyer. I do climate and energy research at IHS Markit. I have a bit of a two-part question. The first part relates to materiality. I know with previous SEC guidance, whether or not climate change presented a material risk to a business was one of the key issues as to how much information was disclosed. And Mary, from some of your earlier remarks, it seems that you're saying that almost every company is facing climate change risk and the materiality is less of a question. So I guess that's a clarification there. And then secondly, amidst all of the different disclosures that are currently out there, You have the CDP that companies report information to. And I've spoken to a lot of investors about climate risk and how they think about it. And there's two-part thinking that they are in some ways inundated with information about climate risk, and in other ways it's hard to kind of separate out what those key metrics are. And the SASB just came out with metrics a week or two ago that looked at just 4 or 5 indicators for each industry. And so I guess my question is the FSB looking at using a similar type framework where you're only looking at a few key metrics, and if you're doing that, then how are you ensuring appropriate contextualization of that information on behalf of investors so that they're able to then use that information in a way that makes sense?
So, great questions. We have taken an inventory, really, in the task force of all the different sets of metrics and standards that are out there. Mark Carney's speech refers to as many as 400 frameworks for measuring climate impacts, and clearly that's in some ways allowed companies to say, you know what, it's too confusing, there's too much out there, there's not clarity around what we should be doing because everybody's got their own plan for what should be disclosed and for which stakeholders we're providing the information. So a key part of our remit was really to build on what's been already been done, but to bring sense and a rational framework to all of that. So we've very much taken notice of the work that's been done. We've had lots of conversations with the key NGOs in this area, and we'll continue to do that right through the completion of the report and the consultation period that will follow it. So we're trying to deal with the we're inundated approach from the companies, and from the investor side, this is not comparable because everybody's reporting under a different regime, so it's not really that valuable to me. I'd like it to be a lot simpler because then we could have some data vendors actually massage and manipulate the information and test it, and it would be much more valuable. So we're very much attuned to that. On the materiality question, we tend to think about materiality as big and now. If it's not a big impact and it's not happening now, it's not material and we don't need to worry about it. And climate really turns that on its head. And so many of our recommendations, some are not, to talk about the governance within your company of climate risk doesn't really require materiality. It requires you to talk about what's the role of your board, how do you integrate this into your strategic planning, how do you incorporate this into your risk management practices and procedures? And those are threshold things that are really important for investors to understand about a company and how it's approaching this very major risk. There are areas where climate is a much more material financial risk. There are those industries that are most likely to be impacted. And the task force has set out separate, heightened guidance for companies in complying with the recommendations for those businesses because of the likelihood of materiality in those. So in energy, in transportation, in agriculture, and in about a half a dozen of them.
Very back row on my left, your right.
Hi. In the very beginning, it sounded like you were saying that the American government...
Can you hold the mic a little just closer to your...
that the government, the taxpayers, would be providing the capital because these companies can't raise capital. They don't get enough interest in getting capital from the private sector. This doesn't sound very free market to me. It sounds kind of like crony capitalism. And I remember years ago there were some companies that did this kind of stuff with taxpayer dollars, like Solyndra, and lost loads of money. And then all this idea of controlling where agriculture is and transportation, it sounds like the government is planning the economy instead of the free market. What would your answer to that be?
And can you share your name and affiliation with us also?
I don't have any affiliation. My name is Mary Carrick.
Great. Obviously, that question's for me. I want to just go back for a second on the last question. I want to affirm, I think, your general point that there's a lot of discussion in this space, and what we need is for people to start coalescing around a common set of tools. That's why I think the process that Mary's heading up is so important. And as a federal actor in this space, I think what we've been trying to do is send a demand signal that is persistent and pushing for greater precision so that, frankly, the data is more useful to us. for planning purposes. So I wanted to reaffirm that, and I'll go a little bit further and just say, I thought the IHS analysis that came out recently was helpful, and that's exactly what we're trying to do, is spur a conversation about what is the right governance here, what are the right ways of thinking about this challenge. Everybody recognizes we're going through a challenging period, dealing with a bunch of new phenomena, and we need to be thoughtful about that. I think too, what is the appropriate role of the federal government? We got 20 countries and some of the leading investors around the world together in Paris last year, talking about the importance of early stage and breakthrough research and development. This is the sort of stuff that yielded us GPS. It yielded us the keyboard that we all punch on every day. It's the type of research that's spurring breakthroughs in dealing with diseases like cancer and Alzheimer's. We invest as a government, as the United States, in research that is underinvested in as by private actors for a host of reasons, including, this is the sort of research where a private firm can't capture all the benefits. It has huge spillover benefits for the society, and it advances public goods that may not be sufficiently valued in a world where externalities aren't effectively priced into the economy. So for a host of reasons, this is business we like to do. Now, there are good ways to do research and there are bad ways to do research, and I feel really good about the pioneering approaches this administration's helped support. That includes investing in foundational things like our national labs, which people have come to know for the breakthroughs they've had. Argonne National Lab has been on the front lines of advancing the battery technology that now is used in the Chevy Volt and other vehicles around the world. You've got labs like Lawrence Berkeley and Sandia that are doing work on preventing cyber attacks to our grid. So there's a bunch of early stage clean energy R&D that's happening in that foundational approach. You got new breakthrough approaches that are really designed to be disruptive of the technology paths we're on. Places like ARPA-E and DARPA. DARPA's been doing it for decades. ARPA-E's been doing it for a decade, and we're seeing real transformation happening there. And then there's the translational work and the integrative work that the research complex needs to be able to do. And I'm not shy about saying, we got to do stuff in the lab, we got to do stuff in the universities, and we got to do stuff on the ground. We got to prove this technology out, and there is a role for the federal government to play to taking that first risk and getting out there and making sure these technologies work, and then stepping away. And the good news is you got folks like Bill Gates and Meg Whitman and Mark Zuckerberg and a host of others who are saying, we're excited about putting our capital out there to pick up the baton and run where it's appropriate for the private sector to step in. So there's an appropriate role. We've got to be skeptical about where that line is. We got to train ourselves on that. Certainly, OMB, the B is budget, so we spend a lot of time thinking about where that line ends so we can get out of the game. But there's a role, and we've got to do the catalytic work to get us to pioneer the solutions we need.
Great. On the topic of continuing the conversation, you all aren't planning on issuing this guidance in December and closing up shop. Can you talk a little bit about how the comment period or the conversation continues
so
from December?
So we will present our report to the Financial Stability Board in late November and issue it for a 60-day public consultation period in early December. After that, we will obviously look at the comments, see if anything needs to change, and provide a final report to the FSB in the spring, whereupon it will land on the desks of the G20 leaders, and they will hopefully take it forward in some fashion.
Terrific. That's great. 2 questions right here. Wait for the mic.
Excuse me. Hi there. Ben Hulak. I'm a reporter with E&E News. Governor Carney, in November, I think the 3 risks he identified were liability, physical, and transition. And we often hear a lot about physical. That's hurricanes. That's, as you said, Chair Shapiro, easy to grasp. I'm curious, though, how do you see these liability risks manifesting on the government side, and then Chair Shapiro, for you, perhaps on the private sector side of things? Thanks.
Well, I think that the private sector, you know, we've come to think about the liability or the legal risks as really manifest from the physical risks, and they are just what you would think they would be. They're cities are underwater. There's enormous legal implications and liability implications to that, or damage from extreme weather events. And so they're out there, we know about them. Sometimes they're insurable risks, sometimes they aren't. But we focus in our work on the task force much more on the transition risk, again, because of our linkage to the financial system in what we're doing and the potential for abrupt repricing of carbon-related assets, for example, to send a shudder through the financial system. And so our focus has much more been there.
That's great.
And I think from a federal government perspective, it sort of depends on which lens you're looking at it from. So if it's procurement, we're talking about the reliability, the procurement, the stability of the vendor, things like that. There you're focusing maybe more on the physical risk. If it's on the other side where you're really trying to safeguard the pensions of millions of Americans, then you're going to be thinking about it from a broader vantage point. And there, I imagine the disclosure's got to be a little bit more robust in other vectors as well. So it sort of depends on what the mission is specifically. But you know, all of these things are I think very important to get at least out into the market, so that everyone's cited on what's going on.
Hi. My question really goes to the issues associated with infrastructure. Infrastructure is clearly very critical in terms of our ability to adapt to and manage through climate change. There's been discussion here about SASB, implicitly about FASB. What's missing is GASB. And what I'm interested in is you made a reference to focusing on HUD activities that were going to incorporate fortified building standards. What I'm really interested in is probably a broader follow-through that would look to municipal bond ratings, and that would particularly look to matching funds. And what is OMB considering, if anything, at this point, about addressing matching funds to combat what turned out to be a lot of conflicting procurement regulation components that are embedded, that use historical, let's say, rainfall pattern data to set up procurement for Army Corps of Engineers as the basis for matching fund for local infrastructure. Is there anything that you're looking at in that context? And then from a disclosure perspective, has or will the disclosure group look at issues associated with municipal bonds?
And what's your affiliation, if you can share with us?
I'm sorry, my name is Lindeen Patton. I work with a small law firm called Earth and Water Group, but I used to be the Chief Climate Product Officer for Zurich Insurance Group for about 20 years.
Well, I can quickly answer. We haven't really focused on the municipal bond market. And of course, there, as you well know, very difficult for the SEC to dictate any kind of disclosure standards in that market either.
Whether it's the Community Development Block Grant, which I referenced, and that works in partnership with municipalities, or its work at the Army Corps, I think the state of the art is not settled yet, and I think there's obviously more work to be done. You make a good point on sort of conflicting values, and I think it's important to recognize different communities are going to approach this in different ways. They're going to prioritize certain things more than others. But as a federal government, I think one of the baseline things we can do to communities, for communities as they start to head down this path is, one, make sure they are not wanting of data and modeling tools. So we've got NOAA and USGS and others who are now, I think, in a way that wasn't true a few years ago, really actively providing information in a way that's usable for municipal, state, local actors. The second is to make sure they're not wanting of capacity to be able to develop the policy changes they have decided they want. And then the third is to not be creating the sort of wrong incentives as people are doing this planning. So let's not reward people for failing to take this stuff into account. And that's, I think, the point I was trying to make earlier about infrastructure, siting, and other decisions. You know, there are a lot of factors that go into what gets built and where. And in a lot of cases, that's a locally driven process. But what we shouldn't be doing as a federal government is setting up incentives to do it in the wrong place or build it where it's not needed. And that's, I think, a process that we're, parts of it we're early days on, parts of it we're maybe further down the tracks. But it's, I think, a big piece of business for the next administration to take on.
We have time for a few more. This gentleman right here.
Jean-François Wattin with a French international economic think tank, CPII. And the work of the task force, I think, is a great addition to Paris, Kigali, Montreal, and so on, because it's a way to leverage financial markets in favor of climate change. But then I looked very quickly before coming in at Dan Jurgen's paper. It seems to me he's a bit of a devil's advocate on that issue, because essentially he says, well, that's not the job of central bankers to talk about climate change. It seems to me he implies that there is an ideological view in Mark Carney's speech. And then he makes a demonstration in terms of risk on financial markets. Look, the price of oil fell way down. 82 companies went bankrupt, but there was no risk to the financial system. So how do you answer to what I read as being critics of the process by Dan in his paper?
Well, I think, look, if climate change is a financial stability threat, then it is very much the business of central bankers to be worried about it. I mean, we can all recall the criticism of regulators and central bankers for not foreseeing the financial stability threats that were building in many economies in the 2000s, so leading up to 2008 and 2009. So, you know, if central bankers believe that this is a financial stability threat because of the potential for repercussions within the financial industry from an abrupt repricing of carbon-related assets, then that is their purview, and I think it's completely appropriate for us to be looking at these issues. That aside, though, it's still incredibly important, whether there's a financial stability issue or not. We could have a legitimate argument about that probably. Investors are demanding this information. They're large institutional investors accounting for trillions of dollars of assets under management need this information, they believe, to make rational decisions about where to invest pensioners' money among all the other types of investors out there. And the financial markets ought to be in a position to give them that information. You know, I've said for my entire professional life, transparency is the lifeblood of markets. Markets are the most powerful tools on earth, and if we can supply the markets with the information they need to understand what these risks are, and then I can make a decision, these risks aren't real, or these aren't risks I'm worried about, or you know, I'll pick this company over that company even though that company does a better job of mitigating or managing those risks because I believe in this company. Those are my free will decisions to make, but I've got to have the information to make those choices, and that's really what this is all about.
It's probably an important disclosure because sometimes these issues can take on a life of their own, and you know the most polarizing issue defines the debate, and then you lose some of it. So one issue is, you know, is disclosure good? What kind of disclosure? And there'll be some specificity on that.
Exactly. And so for me, as a lifelong capital markets regulator and very much a newcomer to the space of climate change I always learn a ton when I get to sit next to Ali because he knows so much and I know so little. But as somebody who believes deeply in transparency in markets, this disclosure, if people determine that they need it, if the reasonable investor believes that they need to understand these risks that may have a material impact on the operations or the finances of this company, then they should have that information.
One question that's come up, and it's related to the unburnable carbon question that we got before, is really time horizon, which is what time horizon are you worried about? And I think the IHS paper said the SEC rules only let companies value their assets, at least 70% of their assets, on what they call 1P reserves you're going to use in the 10, 15 years. It's a huge discount on the outlying assets. So I guess the question is, if you worry about unburnable carbon, then it may be true that those resources owned by the company may not have much value. But over the near-term time horizon, the SEC rules and essentially regulate how companies are permitted to value that. So what sort of time horizon, or are there multiple time horizons that you think this disclosure will
So again, without
look at?
being too specific, because our report's not completed yet, we do talk in terms of short, medium, and long term in our recommendations, and we recognize that there's a continuum of disclosure that's really necessary here.
Super.
And I just on time horizon, I would just say, there's time horizon and there are different planes. There's the accounting valuation, and then there's the political economy implications of certain things that happen in the market. And we've seen markets and the value of companies and the cost of capital for companies fluctuate in a way that's not dollar for dollar relative to the way accounting valuation works. So I think that's an important thing for people to keep in mind.
Good point. Great. Well, if there are no more urgent questions, then I want to thank you for really giving us a tutorial and a primer on what this effort is all about. It's something that the Global Energy Center will continue to follow, both through December. Perhaps you can come back after the Financial Stability Board is briefed and talk about those recommendations. And if you all please join me in thanking our panelists for coming today.